hopefully on the other side of things, the audition process will still be as good as it is, but with the same repertoire. And so I was thinking, like, because I had already started this project, actually it was last winter, I started to really dive into, okay, how am I going to structure this? I figured I have the time, I should probably finish it. And, with the extra time that I did have, I was able to actually add a few more things, like the line shaping that we're talking about.
We are talking today with a friend, colleague, past podcast guest about a very cool book he's just released. I am Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we're talking to Jon McCullough-Benner of the Milwaukee Symphony, principal bassist of the Milwaukee Symphony. He's assistant principal bassist of the Grant Park Music Festival Orchestra. He teaches at Roosevelt University. He's a great guy. What else can I say? Oh, I can say one more thing. He has put out an extremely cool book called An Auditioning Double Bassist's Toolkit: Bowings, Fingerings, and Useful Tips for Standard Audition Repertoire. And this is the sort of resource I wish I had when I was taking auditions, when I was training, when I was in high school, when I was in college. And it's the sort of thing I'm just so glad is out there in the world. Quick shout out to our sponsors, Dorico, Ear Trumpet Labs, Practisma, and Modacity. More on them later. But let's get into this conversation with Jon McCullough-Benner. I think a lot of people have had the idea to do, maybe, but I don't know that I've ever seen this exactly, and I dig it. And I'm going through alphabetically. I just finished Symphonie Fantastique, so I'm playing through it all, and it's really fun. And my wife came out one day and she's like, "What are you doing?" Because she's heard these excerpts, for years and years back when I was auditioning, but she hasn't heard them recently. But it's really been fun to look like kind of through your eyes in some ways at this repertoire.
Right.
So bravo on doing this. It's really excellent.
Thank you. Yeah. Kind of like what you say, it's probably an idea that, a lot of people have had. But one thing that in particular that kind of drove me to do it, I think I say in the intro, like I've had the idea to do this for years and just kind of compile it all into one place, and to also include some very, just logical ways of looking at it that hopefully will help people. The idea of having everything in one place is like one that really, at least it helped me. I remember when I was young and having all these different excerpt books, and if I forgot to bring one to a lesson or something, it was not a good feeling. The thought of having everything in one place definitely was part of the driving force, but also to incorporate a lot of just that applicable knowledge.
Yeah, which you do very elegantly, and I like it's fun to see how people approach like putting in, and just the editorial nature of stuff like this, like what to put in, what not to put in, how to put in. So I'm always interested in how people approach like fingerings and notating string changes, and I think you do that very, very elegantly. Which for people listening, okay, see, it's like when you do make a string change, you put the string change under that note, like under the fingering, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, that was kind of in an effort to minimize, there's already a lot of info in here already. And so in order to, kind of make it a little bit cleaner, putting everything that's related to a fingering below as opposed to, jumping above and then jumping down, like saying, okay, what's that supposed to mean? Because anytime you put a third finger, would that potentially be confused with a triplet? Probably not, but like that kind of thing. I'm glad it reads well.
Oh no, it does. And I mean, that's a tremendous, anybody who, like, I look back at my parts from when I was in college and they look like the works of a stressed out maniac, because I have like fingerings over every single note. I have all these brackets and I'm not sure what they mean. I have A string that's like scribbled out, kind of angry looking with like D string underneath it. I've got some red big arcs that I don't know what they mean. And I know that a lot of people are in that. So it's cool to look, and also just to look at our canon of excerpts. Let's just say, these are our most of our most common, some of our most common audition excerpts through the eyes of someone who has played a lot of it. And I like how you take the multiple passes. I think it's really cool to keep that fingering string information, like on the initial pass, and then you're offering practice examples, which is really, really cool too, to just, here's how one might approach this. And then that, I think you call it line shaping, right? You don't call it exactly phrasing, and you certainly don't call it dynamics, but that's something I look back at my old parts and I have all these arcs and I'm pointing certain notes, and I like the way that you've done this line shaping. It's really cool.
Yeah, thanks. The thought of it, I had a few different approaches to that as far as I knew that was something that I really wanted to incorporate into the book. Of course, there are so many different ways that you can talk about, phrasing or anything, but in thinking about the shape of the line and how each phrase can breathe, where do you put emphasis, where do you not put emphasis, that kind of thing. I felt like that was really important. I went a lot back and forth, trying to decide, okay, do I want to do just regular hairpins, dotted hairpins? On the editorial side of things, what is the clearest way to show this? The dotted hairpins, I think, were probably the best approach there, but it's definitely worth noting, especially if there's any excerpt that might not have any dynamic in there. Like the Bach Violin Concerto second movement. There's nothing really notated in there. But in order to actually make something of it where it's not going to be so plain, put yourself in the shoes of somebody that's on the other side of the screen. They want to hear a musician making music. As much as it's good to just have something that's completely plain because the part is plain, there still has to be something in there. And so I guess that's kind of where that stems from.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a smart way to do it. And it's something that anybody who's certainly prepared for anything or has taught, you struggle with, how to. And it's okay, go to this note. Well, what do you mean? And it's tricky because that means a lot of things. That could mean dynamics. In some cases, that could mean a little bit of a tempo alteration. That could certainly mean a tonal alteration or a vibrato alteration. And so that's a nice way that you did it. Just here's, we're going here because you're going there. And I like how you did a separate pass for that too. That info comes, and I also like the way you weave in the description both of the piece and of what to think about as you're working on it. It's the sort of thing I wish I had as I was preparing things. So it's just really, really cool. So I used to have this binder that was maybe 5 inches thick with everything in it, and then I would have my audition binder that was a little thinner that I would photocopy and put stuff in. I'm assuming you had
yeah,
okay. I'm assuming you had.
I have it right here.
Okay.
And of course, people on the podcast aren't going to be able to see this.
Wow.
But this is a lot of what I was working from, and so. There are a lot of things in here that aren't necessarily included, but even if it is just this one big binder, you still have everything in one place.
Not that we're comparing binder sizes, but your binder beats my binder. That's incredible. And I remember talking to Rob Knopper of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, and he's I don't remember the exact term he has, but he's just an information sponge. Anything about any excerpt he would soak in, and all his notes and everything, and there's just such value in that too. So it's and I've put together a few print publications over the years, and I know the complexity of taking source material like that and baking it down into something. This you must have spent a ton of time putting this together. That is I can't even imagine. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of time. There was a lot of time spent in here, almost to the point where if I had closed my doors, the cats would be howling on the other side of the door, and it took a while. I didn't actually count the amount of hours as far as note input and making sure details were there. And I have to say, I think honestly, the easiest part of it was probably putting in the fingerings. If I were to guess, it was at least 200 hours worth of just sitting in front of the computer and going through it all.
Oh, it had to be. I put together this little audition book in 2016, which is hilarious because I'm a giant audition loser. So there's no reason I should be doing anything like that. But that took me. I feel like that took me a couple months of my life, just out and just the level of detail. It's a beautiful project. Of the things you could be doing during a pandemic, this is a pretty cool thing to come out of it. And I love how you have this not really exited an existential crisis in the preface, but you have like, look, I'm writing this during this time when auditions aren't happening and we're not even sure like the next time we'll play some of these giant works, but we will persevere. And I think if we look at any pandemic through history, we do persevere and we do come through it.
Exactly.
But it's I sort of enjoyed that moment because that's something that probably a lot of people prepping for things are thinking about.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and especially, I know I've used this phrase a lot in the book. It's always good to be flexible, especially thinking about how our industry has evolved into, especially the audition process. Not a whole lot of that is going to change.
Right.
And especially with, a lot of people having, at least in my case, having a lot of extra time right now. What better way to investigate how we can do our art better? Especially for anyone that might have been like right on the verge of the audition trail going into the spring. I mean, that would have been quite the blow to figure out, like, okay, like all these auditions were going to happen and none of them are. What do I do now? Hopefully on the other side of things, the audition process will still be as good as it is, but with the same repertoire. And so I was thinking, like, because I had already started this project, actually it was last winter, I started to really dive into, okay, how am I going to structure this? I figured I have the time. I should probably finish it. And, with the extra time that I did have, I was able to actually add a few more things, like the line shaping that we're talking about.
This episode is brought to you by Dorico, the advanced music notation software by Steinberg. And here is Senior Product Manager Daniel Spreadbury on the challenges of designing music notation software.
I think one of the things about a music notation software is that it does so many jobs to do because it's serving such a wide range of users, whether you're a high school teacher or you're a student or you're a composer doing concert music or you're doing a jazz chart or you're doing movie music or you're doing an audio mock-up for a job or a music -1 rehearsal track for your ensemble or whatever it is. The jobs to be done, they cross, this enormous horizon.
I am a huge fan of Dorico. I use it every single day. There's a free version you can check out that lets you do practically everything up to 2 parts. So if you're doing exercises or bass duets or anything like that, that will meet your needs. And you can check out the other options as well. Dorico.com will take you there. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Ear Trumpet Labs. These are hand-built microphones out of Portland, Oregon, and they make an excellent mic for upright bass called Nadine. Barry Green got to try this mic at our 2020 online bass summit where Ear Trumpet Labs was a sponsor, and he was singing its praises all weekend long. It's an instrument-mounted condenser mic with an incredibly clear, natural sound and great feedback rejection. It's durable and works with in-ears, monitors, you name it. Not to mention, Christian McBride, Barry Bales, and Missy Raines are all Nadine users. Whether it's classical, jazz, Americana, or bluegrass, this mic seriously delivers, and they're offering a free t-shirt, especially to Contrabass Conversations listeners with a purchase of a mic. Just visit www.eartrumpetLabs.com/contrabass to claim yours and check out Nadine. I'm glad that made it in because it's that is an extra level and so it has been fun for me to actually I like going through everything that I get something I want to go through it all, and it's really been cool to play through it with the initial pass, and like looking at the fingerings and your observations, and then I also really appreciate the practice suggestions, whether to do something rhythmically or to loop certain parts, and it's just cool. Right. For me, and I'm not even taking auditions, but certainly for somebody who's doing that, to see what somebody with experience at this and a track record of success at this and who's taught a lot of people at this would recommend. Because there are so many things you could do. Like, what do you do to practice Beethoven 5? Well, good question. What are the things that trip people up? Good question. So it's that and then to take that pass through the phrasing, it's an elegant way to do it. And it's cool to see, many people have a project in the back of their mind, and those projects get out into the world sometimes, not that often, a lot of the time. So it's cool to see something actually get out there that is related to auditions and that's like this, and that I think is super useful. So just bravo on actually pressing launch on this. It's a hard thing.
Yeah, I mean. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's, like I said, I mean, it's a project that I've been, kind of like, nagging myself to do for a long time. Mm-hmm. But, I figure there are so many different ways that you can practice excerpts, right? Even going back to like the title of the book and auditioning double bassist toolkit. Think about any mechanic. Different mechanics aren't going to necessarily need the same tools. This is just one perspective that has worked for me, and I just hope that it works for somebody else too. I am so glad that I took a Psychology 101 class in college, and just the very basic bare bones of like, okay, what is the process of learning? Just in like the very, very broad sense, you can apply it to anything. Taking what I had learned from that class and applying it to what I did on, with, my approach to excerpts and things, that's a lot of where that comes from, actually, is just that very rudimentary psychology of, okay, how does the brain learn? And applying that to excerpts, you have to learn every excerpt so well that it's just going to be a part of you, right? Like, so that when the pressure is on, that enough of what make who you are as a player beat the pressure. It's easy to say, over the short term, like, oh, I've got an audition next week. What do? I'm just going to play a lot. As we know, that's not necessarily the most efficient use of time.
Right. Well, so what worked for you, or what have you seen we've talked to? Because that's a giant thing, like the stakes are so high in auditioning, right?
Worms.
Yeah, because okay, now we're going to spend multiple thousands of dollars on a hotel room and a flight and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, I've prepared in theory, but then I walk out there and I'm in the back of Symphony Center in Chicago, and I'm in this metal elevator, and now I'm watching the screen of the person auditioning before me, and I'm like the stage hands are talking, or what, not that necessarily happens. I'm just remembering an experience from 20 years ago, but
right.
What do you recommend, or what have you learned? Because you're somebody that someone would look at your resume and be like, this guy's on his game. Look, he's done quite well in this business. How did you learn to keep from falling apart, or what have you recommended to students or folks that are preparing for these?
Oh man.
And that's a huge question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where to start. I mean, there are just so many aspects to consider. One of the first things that I would do when I decide to take an audition would be, and it's actually not even necessarily like in the book or anything, is actually, of course, I mean, you get your audition list, you figure out that you're going to take the audition, but it's very important to visualize everything. Visualize yourself, being in the town. Okay, if you decide that you're going to book a hotel, okay, where's that going to be? If you're going to rent a car, what car is that going to be? What is your route going to be like to get to the hall? Kind of literally mapping out everything. And, as crazy as that might seem, it's a process that I did. When I auditioned here in Milwaukee, this is true of my audition for Oregon Symphony as well. I actually booked hotels that were near the airport. As good as it is to be conveniently located close to the hall, if you're at an airport, you can practice pretty much whenever you want. You can do your work when you want, and you don't necessarily have to worry about, like, if you're playing in the middle of the day, nobody's going to be there. Usually people that stay at airports are there for like a super early, like 4 a.m. flight or something. And so, that's something that I did. So I would visualize that, but also visualize myself in the hall before auditions in both, Oregon and here in Milwaukee. I did a lot of like Google image search of Eline Hall or Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall, and just to see like, okay, what is this going to be like when I'm in there? I guess what helped me to that point was having a couple auditions where I didn't do that. And I remember, I think, where was it? I think it might have been, it was somewhere, a very, very beautiful hall that sounded great. Mm-hmm. Where I remember I was taken aback in the middle of my prelim round, like, the hall sounds really, really good. And, it just took that much for me to say, okay, I'm off my game. I'm probably not going to advance. And so, visualizing that sort of thing was pretty helpful. And then in getting into just how you're practicing the excerpt list, you work on what you need to, right? Because the Beethoven 5 trio really well doesn't necessarily mean that you need to practice it like an hour a day. And so getting into those sort of short looping exercises, that kind of helped me kind of organize, in my brain, okay, how do these specific small details need to go? There are a lot of different ways to program information in your brain, right? You can do it forwards and backwards. There are a couple instances, in this book where if you train yourself to be able to say, okay, I can learn this forwards and backwards, you're just going to be a lot better off and just having things programmed.
Yeah, I like you. Yeah, I played through some of those backward examples, and it's cool that you actually included, because people say that often. Oh, learn it forwards and backwards, but it's really cool to see you actually. No, here's how it would go that way, and it was really
right.
And I think it's great that you included writing out elements of those exercises, because it's the sort of thing that you might read and just sort of go on to the next thing, but you see it and you're like, oh no, let me try this. So I'm finding myself playing backwards through excerpts. So you're like, oh yeah, that's actually super useful. It's like, I remember talking to Ed Barker years ago about how it's like your brain's a ball of clay, and every time you practice something a little differently, you're like widening and deepening that groove.
Yeah, and actually, it's funny. I actually used that same analogy, and I forget where I learned that from. And it might have been a Contrabass Conversations podcast. But I forget if there's like a psychological element to that, or what teacher might have like used that. But I mean, it's definitely super useful to have. If you have different ways to approach things. It's like this ball of clay analogy. You've got just different ways that you're putting indents into the clay.
It's probably something to do with myelination. Like if you've read, or folks have read, The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle, talking about the actual sheathing of the neurons. That's a great book because it actually shows what's happening during the learning process, and like anything to like mix it up. I mean, I'm simplifying what it is, but that's incredibly useful in just sort of like programming these things into the nervous system.
Totally. It's been a long time since I touched that book, and I need to pick it up again. You're reminding me to pick it up again. Yeah, I mean, totally. The stronger that you can make all those connections, especially in something that's like so high pressure, the better off you're going to be. It's all definitely a training process. Yeah. And as much as people get wrapped up in the physical element of playing the bass, like sometimes it's easy to ignore just what all you need to train your brain to do. If you do all this physical practice on one bass and then say that, if you're on your flight to the audition and, something happens at the airport or something, what do?
Yeah.
It's not like you're going to be able to relearn everything on a new bass.
Right.
It's all totally mind oriented, where you can say, okay, here's how this excerpt sounds. Here's my approach to it. Here's how I think about it musically in being a complement to the score. If you wrap all that into one package, you should be able to do that on any bass you want.
Yeah, it's a thing that's so tough, though, for people to realize, because it seems like it's an athletic event. But actually, if we think about athletics, they also are mental so much, right? It's like yes, you're using your body, but it's all and in many ways, for a variety of reasons, athletics are maybe ahead of us in terms of that, realizing that, but it's the sort of thing that I know that I struggled with. Is like, I got to put in 8 hours a day banging out Beethoven 5. Meanwhile, I do worse and worse in every subsequent audition because I didn't take that Psychology 101 course, maybe, or a variety of reasons, but it's that's one of those things that it's a little bit of it can be a little bit confusing to realize how important those components really are.
Totally, and it's always good to test yourself too, and especially. Like, I forget if I talked about this on our last interview or not. Maybe you can.
I'll link up to it for sure. But yeah, I can't. Yeah.
My process before my Oregon Symphony audition, where I had a couple auditions where I didn't necessarily play as well as I wanted, and a lot of it just amounted down to nerves because I cared so much about it. And I remember, I think it was the month or month and a half before. I think it was. So that audition was, I think, November 14th or something. I remember it was early October. I started just rounding up a bunch of bass players and other musicians to say, okay, who has 10 minutes? Or, just asking, hey, I'll buy a coffee if I can play for you. I think I aimed to do 2 mock auditions a day. And, there were a lot of times where that would end up being 1 or 0. I would, even on the days where I wouldn't necessarily do a real mock audition in front of people, I would still record myself. And the month or month and a half leading up to the audition was just like constant testing. Mm-hmm. Like, do I have everything in order so that when I'm under pressure, I've got everything just nailed down.
My daily companion for practicing is the app Modacity. I love it so much. And the interface is so simple. You open it up and you see a microphone and a timer. And here is Modacity founder Mark Gelfo on why you see that in the interface.
It comes down to practice efficiency. And practice efficiency, the way that I think about it, is an equation with 3 different variables. One of them is learning milestones, one of them is retention, and the other is time. I define practice efficiency as learning milestones times retention divided by time spent.
Modacity has helped my practicing so much and so many other people I know. You can learn more at modacity.co and visit our site for a special offer on lifetime access to this app. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. I'm so happy that my course, Beginners Classical Bass, is out in the world on Discover Double Bass, and we've been getting some great feedback. Here's Barry Green, instructor of bass at The Ohio State University, former principal bassist of the Cincinnati Symphony, and author of The Inner Game of Music. Barry writes about the course. This wonderful, extensive course includes 14 chapters of 66 lessons, varying in length from 1 to 8 minutes each. It is so comprehensive. While it is called a beginner's course, this only means that the course begins with the parts of the instrument, including how to take the bass out of the case. However, it also takes the player through the most advanced left and right hand techniques, including shifting, pivoting, harmonics, positions up to the thumb position, tuning the bass, scales and arpeggios, as well as left hand techniques of dynamics, bow placement, articulations, including portato, staccato, and slurring. Barry, thank you so much. And folks, if you haven't checked it out, you can find it through the link in the show notes or just visit discoverdoublebase.com/Jason Heath. It seems like that's the common thread among so many people that have been successful, is like playing in front of people and recording themselves. I remember talking to Blake Hinson a couple of years ago when I was in New York, and just like recording was like the thing. Or even talking to Robin Kesselman. He was like recording himself, an hour before going into the audition on his phone, like listening. So it's those are the things that are hard and painful, right? Like playing mocks for other people and then recording and listening to the bitter truth.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's important to know how exactly you sound. And, it can be easy to get kind of like stuck in your own head of like, okay, I sound a certain way, and really like on the other side of the bass, it's like something completely different. I mean, that was super helpful. And, and of course, like to get to that point, it took a lot of like that kind of nitty gritty, just, really getting super detailed of, okay, how do I want Brahms 2 letter E to sound? Or, Mozart 39 Allegro. How do I want each of these to sound in order to portray what I like musically, but also doing justice to the music itself? I guess like going back to that, the E major violin concerto, like where, considering, in the beginning of that movement, like, we've got main material. How often does that happen? It's a big deal. How can you do justice to the score or for the score through just the portrayal of one line? Say like, I guess, going back to Brahms 2 letter E, where we have those quarter notes with the accents. What happens in the orchestra there? Making sure that, even just as a solo bass part, that, what you're doing in an audition situation can, reach members of the committee who might not play the bass.
You mentioned that in your book through a few times, which is a good thing to think about. And folks might not realize, who haven't been on a committee or looked behind, but it's, people imagine they're just playing for the entire bass section. That is not what's happening.
Think about it, again, Brahms 2 letter E. What happens when we have that ba-da-da-dum? Excuse my saying. So what happens there? Like the violas, and I think it's the clarinets, that have these like really kind of funky syncopations. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. And so, like, if you're a viola, put yourself in their shoes. If you're a violist on that committee, and a bass player isn't necessarily playing totally in time, how's that going to go?
Right.
Or if you're playing Heldenleben and there's a horn player in the committee, how do you? I mean, obviously, like, you can't please anyone. Well, I shouldn't say you can't please anyone. You can't please everyone. But if you do enough, like, of that kind of like musical homework, that really can do a lot of good for people on the committee that aren't necessarily a bass player.
It's a good thing to think about. It's one of those things that you might not think about until you've had a little bit more experience under your belt, but it's so critical. And in my limited experience being on committees, I've noticed that it's like, oh wow, the principal clarinet thinks so differently about. They're like, oh, and I remember talking to Robin Kesselman about this when he was playing for other people. You're playing all these like Ricky Tikki articulations, and then a wind player would be like, wow, that was impressive. I guess I couldn't hear a single pitch, but I think you were articulating pretty well, I guess. And it's just interesting what other ears that have lived in other soundscapes besides like double bass, experience.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why, like, for anyone that's going to be on the audition trail, it's really important to play for other people that aren't just bass players. In order to develop that perspective, okay, not that any musician, like any instrument, is going to have this, like, kind of broad blanket of how they think about stuff, but just to develop, like, okay, it's possible that given this situation that someone might think X, Y, Z. Is there anything that would be applicable to change given that instance? It's really important to do your homework, especially diving into the score. I mean, it's not something that I feel like I didn't quite do enough of in my early years, but especially as I continue on here, it's really important to just kind of consider, okay, how does this puzzle go together? And that can be really useful, especially just as a solo instrument. So
yeah, there's a volume 2 of this, is like which not that you need more pandemic projects, but take every single one of these and apply these to the score. You'll if you need another 500 hours worth of pandemic work, there.
Yeah.
I have a totally random. This is going to seem out of the blue, but since
Sure.
I have the principal bass of a major orchestra on the line. Okay, so I'm doing these. And then I got some more things about auditioning I'd love to talk about. I'm
Sure.
doing these historical videos. I've started doing these things. Who were these different people? And I'm working on a Dittersdorf one. So I was talking to a bassist in Brussels, and part of the question was like, why the heck is the Dittersdorf Concerto the standard rep in Europe and extremely uncommon here? And then the flip side to that is, why is Bach so common here on auditions and is almost unheard of in European orchestras? And so, I'm animating these characters in Photoshop. I'm like cutting off Dittersdorf's head and like I'm doing all sorts of things. So
yeah, I saw a little bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're going to get more silly. So I'm like working on my but hopefully a serious nature. So somebody with your experience and like, I mean, I have thoughts on this, but I've not nearly the level of experience in this. But do you have any thoughts? And sorry for bringing this up out of the blue, but any thoughts on?
Oh, you're good.
Why is the Dittersdorf Concerto not so common here? And then also, why is Bach Suite so commonly asked?
I mean, that's an interesting question. If I were to just take a guess here, my best guess would probably have to do with just the technical elements. Which is why, like, if you see, on an American audition lists, the standard concertos will usually be like Bottesini, Kusevitsky, Van Hall, and with Dittersdorf not included. And so, like, if you group those three together, they're all pretty technical. Whereas Dittersdorf being, very much like a lot of arpeggios. Not necessarily like really pushing the limit of the range of the instrument or anything. But that being said, because it's so simple, you can really see a a lot about that player's either discipline and or musicality, with something that is musically a little bit more on the simple side.
Yeah.
And so, with Bach, I would say, I'm trying to organize my thoughts because I've got a couple. I guess the biggest thing would be, with an unaccompanied work, you've got a chance to kind of feel out the space a little bit, for one, but two, you get a little bit more of a technical outlook on how that player approaches the instrument. And so, especially given just the construction of, any Bach movement, you get, it's just like it's a perfect little window. And okay, how do they practice their scales and arpeggios, And so in being a cello suite and not necessarily written for the bass, it's, it's going to have a lot more of a technical element to it.
Well, it's an interesting, this is I haven't really heard this talked about. So this is, I'm sort of interested in, I think the reason why, and again, this is speculation on my part, but I think there might be something there. The reason why people might ask for Bach paired with another like a Kuzovitsky or Badazine or whatever, talking to this bassist in Belgium, he was saying, well, the standard pairing is Dittersdorf paired with a more lyrical concerto. So it might be that Dittersdorf and Bach are serving kind of a similar function. And if you think about violin auditions, like how many times is Mozart asked, and why is Mozart violin concerto? Why is a Mozart violin concerto asked? I think it might be for a similar reason because he was saying there's so much more latitude in like a Badazine or even a Von Hall, and there are all these different editions of Von Hall, like what's up an octave, what's down an octave, this and that.
Exactly.
Versus Dittersdorf, there's a lot less of that, and also like the way that you approach, like the scalar nature, and even if we think of the register of like the Dittersdorf first movement versus, let's say, the bourrées from the third suite, they're in a very similar register. So I wonder if those might be the same impulse that people across the pond are asking for that versus this.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. And while I can't say I've taken any auditions in Europe or anything, thinking about how I would approach taking an audition like that, where I wouldn't necessarily be preparing Bach, it would probably kind of fall into that basket.
I know it's weird. It's weird though, because like I have taken 0 auditions in Europe, but I've talked to a lot of people who have, and it's funny because I'll say Bach, and even here 2020, I'll say, oh yeah, Bach is just standard on American auditions, and people say what? Why? And I think we have a similar reaction. Like, I have a former student who's playing principal bass in an orchestra in Germany, and he's like, oh yeah, every that is your piece, Dittersdorf. That is the piece that by which you audition. And I always thought it was so peculiar that it was that. So that's been of curiosity to me, and I born and raised here and only auditioning here, I also am like, the last time I played the Dinosaur Concerto was with my high school orchestra back in the early 90s, so I haven't really thought a lot about that piece. Certainly haven't taught it much unless someone had to learn it for something, but it's just kind of interesting how and why things become part of the audition canon.
Totally. Well, and I think the Dinosaur Concerto is like totally good to learn. And is especially in being a little bit more, it's obviously not as technically challenging as like what you would see in Van Hall, Kuzovitsky, Bottesini, but especially for really making sure that solid fundamentals are there. I mean, it's great for that. And there are actually some nice parts of it. Like I actually just in testing out some of the equipment that I have in here, like I recorded a little bit of the second movement, and it's it's got some nice stuff in it. It's not like it's totally, kind of like blank canvas or anything. It's a concerto.
It's a great piece. I mean, he can be compared unfavorably to like Haydn and Mozart, other people that he actually played in a quartet with those guys. I'm learning as I do my research, but it's actually quite. And if this one ends up playing with orchestra, you realize, wow, this is written well for bass and orchestra. You do not need to be mic'd, unlike something like the Tubin where it can be almost impossible to be heard, or the Kuzovitsky too, for that matter. But it's interesting, and it's one of those pieces that I've said this to students a lot, that it falls into that unfortunate category of it's harder, it sounds easier than it is, right? You kind of want a piece to sound maybe more challenging or flashy than it actually is. That at least, if you're working on something, and part of that is the nature of just how, because it was written for Viennese tuning, how it lies. Although I was just watching some videos of people playing in Viennese tuning on the Dinosaur. It's not like it's that much easier in Viennese tuning. It's just a little bit different, with some harmonic different spots and the like.
Totally. And it's interesting how, looking at something, looking at performers who do it in Viennese tuning, like how that might potentially inspire somebody to play it in orchestral tuning. Like, at least, it's always good to investigate a little bit of the history in order to inform your performance. Even if, say, if you're, doing Dinosaur for an audition, it's not like you're going to be, changing strings, for an audition or anything, or bring two basses out for that matter.
Right. That's work.
But you can use that to make an informed decision of, okay, maybe, I could play a couple harmonics here or there, in order to kind of accurately reflect how this might have been done. Yeah.
And it's been interesting to me going down this Viennese tuning rabbit hole. Not that I'm going to start tuning my bass like that or anything like that, but how I sort of had in my mind Von Hall and Dittersdorf and pieces like that it'd all of a sudden just be a piece of cake and easy. And it's not really the case. 16th notes are still 16th notes. Still shifting all over the place. It's just certain things are maybe a little bit more conducive, but it's not like as radically different as maybe my uninformed brain thought it was.
Right. Well, and there's certainly some things that would be easier. How easy is it to play a harmonic?
Right.
It'll just, it'll come out of the bass, no problem.
Yeah.
But even then, you still have so many technical elements of just kind of having to rewire. Okay, how am I going to play this passage? And in order to accurately reflect what you want to portray musically.
Yeah.
I imagine it's kind of like tomato.
for sure. Hey, there's one more thing I wanted to dig in with you, and I don't know if I have this framed very well, but let me ramble just for a second here. But okay, so I was it's sort of the topic of staying inspired when you're doing the same thing year after year, and so I'll frame it with, I had two conversations recently. One is with Brian Marcus, who's a bassist in the San Francisco Symphony here. He's been in the orchestra 40 years, or I think this is his 40th season, a very weird 40th season right now, I'm sure. But he seems to me, and by talking to him, as inspired as in day one. He is so pumped to be in the orchestra, playing in the section. And then I was talking last week with Dave Kreibel, who's a horn player who retired from the San Francisco Symphony golly, like 20 years ago at this point. He's in his mid-80s. But this guy, he is a walking history of orchestral performance in the U.S. He was hired by Fritz Reiner in the Chicago Symphony in like 1952 to play in the Chicago Symphony. One of those go to Reiner's hotel room. He was in the orchestra for all those moments people have heard about of dictatorial Reiner, like firing people on the spot. Then he went to Detroit in the late 60s. He's like playing principal horn in Detroit during the Motown era. And just this, we worked with anybody you name it, then came to San Francisco in the late 70s with principal horn through the first few years of Michael Tilson Thomas. And it was just interesting to see this person who still is into music playing a principal instrument for 40 years or whatever under all these legends. Like, how I think it can be. And I've seen people not stay inspired, too, for sure. And I'm sure you have, too. Yep. We could probably name a lot of names we both know that are just like punching the clock. But how do you does it get old for you? I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but just like after being on the other side. And Dave's book, by the way, is called Through the Door, which I think is a great book. It's like you see things from one side, then you go and you're in it. And it's a very different experience. performance. How is it for you, many years in at this point of being in a professional orchestra, doing this full time, being a principal player, seeing the same rep come and go, the inevitable quibbles behind the scenes that just are the life of an orchestral musician. Like, how do you keep excited, or what's that experience been like for you?
Oh man. So, the first thing that came to mind, at least for me, it's always very, very important to stay connected to your upbringings. If that makes sense. So for me, I don't keep up with him as much as I should have, but I played a lot for, his name is Mark Barnard. He was the one that really kind of like gave me the push into like going into bass playing, just like in just being so inspiring. He actually went to USC and studied with Dennis Tremblay for a bit, and then went to NEC, and I guess was down in Miami sort of around when New World was starting to get going. And so, but he lived in Dayton when I did. So when I was first starting to play the bass, he was the major push behind that. And so, I've kept up with him. I should keep in better touch with him, but every conversation that I have with him now is at least like 3 hours long.
Nice.
Where we just, he kind of gives me a little bit more of like this perspective of, okay, like, John, here's what you did way back when. Here's how you can apply it now. And so he's been very, very important to in helping that. Just this past fall, not this fall, but in 2019, I was lucky enough to be able to play the Bottesini Concerto with the high school orchestra that I was a part of.
That's awesome.
And so, talking with teachers, from way back when that were kind of helping me, in getting my feet on the ground. I feel like that's pretty important to just kind of stay connected with them. But as far as the day to day, it's really important to consider. No two performances are ever going to be alike, and there could be certain things that that'll go differently one night toward versus the last, and so in keeping it inspired, there's for me there's always had to been this kind of thought of, okay, like what not that you're going to want to change a ton of stuff like over the course of a weekend or anything, but what special outlook could you have towards that performance that'll really kind of give it the sparkle, I guess, if that makes sense. And that's easier to do sometimes than others, but it's really important to consider, like, okay, how can this performance be especially meaningful, and especially as I look back and to the past when, like, all of this was new versus now. It's always good to have, if there's a way to kind of bring back that, I guess, curiosity of, how, what can you bring to this? That was kind of, that could be really important, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes sense for sure. It makes sense. But, hey, maybe one more question, just as we were talking about this, that I asked Dave, the horn player, too.
Sure.
When you look back at what you've played, whether it's in Milwaukee, Oregon, a festival, anything, do you have any of those top? Like, I can think of a few top performances, things that I'll remember forever, and one of them, for a variety of reasons, is playing Mahler 3. under Michael Tilson Thomas Pacific Music Festival in Japan, outdoors in the summer. So like the longest piece of the standard lit in like 110 degrees or something miserable like that, in tuxedos, with this bass coach from the Vienna Philharmonic who's drinking beer backstage, before we go out, and like giving us like advice on articulation. It's just one of those like amazing like training moments. You're like, where am I and what is going on? And
right.
But it was like such an incredible experience. Do you have any of those like when you, like if you think of moments, and they could be bad moments too, like caught on the tour bus or something, but do you have any of those moments that you're gonna keep with you for decades from the stage?
The first one I'll say, it was actually the first time I ever subbed in the Cincinnati Symphony. I remember getting a call from Owen, my former teacher. I was lucky enough to study with him in high school, and I kept in touch with him. And even when I was at IU, I remember having, because the way the orchestras worked at IU, at least back then, I'm not sure if it's the same way now or not, but like you would have a couple of weeks off in between concert cycles. And I remember getting a call from Owen just like as I was walking home from kind of a long day of practicing, like, hey John, I was wondering if you could play Bruckner 7 with us this week. We're just start tomorrow morning. I remember just thinking, okay, I need to pack. I need to grab my bass. When's the last time I looked at Bruckner 7? I mean, thankfully it was under my fingers, but just like that, I remember that was like kind of a big moment. Mm-hmm. Where, playing with the Cincinnati Symphony is a big deal. And, especially to be sharing the stage with a former teacher. I mean, that was a really big deal for me. And I do remember, because I think that was when Leland Gray was pretty new on the job there. Just that there is that kind of electricity of, relatively recent hire as music director, and Bruckner 7. Yeah. Which I mean, that was a pretty magical moment. And so, I won't list any specifics, during the concert, but I remember that was a pretty big deal. And as far as like other performances, I will say the other meaningful performances for me, I don't know if I break down, don't put that in here.
Okay,
but,
no worries.
Just for your reference, I lost my dad in April.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
It's okay. That's part of the reason I ended up digging into this so much. Mm-hmm. The other really, really important performances for me were when my folks were in the audience.
Yeah. And
so the one of the first times, I think I was playing the Lexington Philharmonic at this point, playing the Elgar Enigma Variations, which was like a really important piece for my mom and also my dad. So that was kind of a big deal to have them in the audience. They came out to Portland to see me do Tchaik 5 out there. And then just a couple of years ago, we did Beethoven 9 with, I think it was June Markle was conducting then. And so, those were especially important performances. To have, somebody meaningful in the audience that's like kind of witnessing, the kind of magic that you're making up there. Yeah. I mean, that's been pretty important stuff.
You rock, John. Thank you so much for putting this together. I'm going to be using this book myself in my teaching for years to come. And like I said, well, really throughout this conversation and in the intro and everything, it's the sort of thing I wish I had had when I was training. It's just so great to get away from all those materials that I had photocopied over the years in my audition binders and things scribbled out and that sort of thing, and to look at something nice and clean and with the eye of a seasoned professional, the way it's laid out, just really, really cool material. material. Thank you so much for listening to this. Here we are in the holiday season, at least as I record this. I think it is December 30th, 2020. And I've lost all track of time, or most of my track of time, and I am having a sleepy week or so here in San Francisco. Just enjoying as best as I can, we can, the wife and the dog, and working on projects and the like. This podcast, I feel, has helped to keep me sane in 2020. I look forward to, like you, I'm sure, leaving my house sometime soon and hopefully going back to doing things in person on the road. I've got all sorts of ideas for where this podcast is going to go. And I appreciate being able to connect with Jon and other folks over Zoom, like Jon and I did, or whatever. But oh boy, do I miss hanging out with people in person. I feel like I'm repeating myself on every episode, but I'm going to reiterate that one more time here at the end of 2020 or early 2021 as you're listening to this. So thank you for being with me on this journey. If this is your first episode, well, welcome. If you've been with me since the very beginning, what is that, 13 years ago? 13 years ago. Yikes. Thank you. It's just a thing that I do, and I don't know why I do it, but I enjoy it, and it's just a part of my life, and it's been an increasing part of my life the last few years, but it's been with me since, how old was I when I started this? 29, 30, something like that. So anyway, I enjoy it. I appreciate you listening. Feedback at I can't even say it. I'm not going to edit though. No editing, Jason. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com is the email if you want to get in touch with me, just to say hi, guest suggestion, anything like that, that would be appreciated. Thank you to the team that has been putting these episodes together with me for years at this point. They are Michael Cooper and Steve Hinchy, Mitch Mooring, Trevor Jones, and Krista Copper. Mitch makes beautiful basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Kilgore, Texas. Just an imaginative luthier, great human being. MitchMooring.com is his website. Check out what he's up to. I am your host, Jason Heath. Goodbye, 2020. Hello, hopefully better times. And we will see you again soon in a new year for more life on the lower end of the spectrum.